Now that this works, let me come back to this content and let's see how we could make this content a bit more complex. To be precise, let's see how we could add images or code snippets to this content. Because since we're building a blog and we are developers, we might be blogging about development topics. And that means that we also might want to share code snippets as part of our posts. The great thing is that we can easily add such snippets and also images to Markdown, but when it comes to rendering that, we'll face certain challenges, which we are going to solve together though. Let's start with adding images to our Markdown content. Attached you find an updated Getting Started with Next.js Markdown file, and you can replace your existing one with it. It has the same metadata, but different content. Just some dummy content with a list, another title, and also with an image. This is how you include an image in Markdown. The problem is if you save that and you reload this page, the image is not showing up because the path is incorrect. Now we could fix the path here and change it to images/post and then our slug, so getting started with Next.js. Make sure you have no typos. And then also add that image, which you also find attached. You also need to do that. Attached, you find a Next.js file-based routing PNG dummy image, which you can also add to your post folder in the images folder. So to this specific posts folder there. Now this path should be correct. Whoops, that should be posts though. But if you check for all typos, it should be correct. And if you reload now, you should see the image here. But we have a couple of problems. Clearly, it's too big. It's not styled. Now we could style it. That wouldn't be a problem. We could style it by simply adjusting the styles in the post content module file. We could target image elements here and, for example, give them a max width of 200 pixels or something like this. And now it would be smaller. So that is a problem which we can solve. I'll get rid of this though, but that's something we could solve. The bigger problem is that we're not taking advantage of Next.js image optimizations here. If we inspect this, we see that it's a regular image element which is being rendered here. And that is okay, but we give up on all the optimization potential. For example, this is a huge image file. It's huge. And even if I change the size in CSS, we still load this original file. And that's definitely not what we want. Lazy loading would also be nice to have, because the image is not even visible when we start reading this post, and therefore it would be great if it is only loaded once we scroll there. And that's all something Next Image does for us, but not right now, because by default, React Markdown translates an image in the Markdown file, so translates code like this, into a regular image tag. And that makes a lot of sense, because how would it know that you want to have your own image transformation, that you want to use a different component? It doesn't know that, but you can tell it. And therefore, first of all, I'll get rid of that path here and just stick to the image file name here, because we will now override how React Markdown treats Markdown content like this, how it treats images. To override how certain elements are rendered, we can give React Markdown a special prop, the renderAs prop. renderAs wants an object where you tell React Markdown how certain elements should be rendered. Now you can't come up with your own elements here. Instead, there are built-in elements where you can override the default. The React Markdown documentation is the place to go for more details. There you find detailed usage instructions. You can also configure other things there. And there you also get like a list of the different elements it's able to render and the identifier in renderAs. So for example, for an image, it by default renders the image element, and we can target an image property in our renderAs object if we want to override it. So renderAs, our, let's say, custom renderAs, is an object. That's what we should pass to renderAs if we want to override some renderAs. And in this object, we can now target identifiers like image here, like this, and set them as a property, or to be precise, as a method. And React Markdown will call this method if it finds an image in the Markdown content. And we can do this for other kinds of elements as well, as you see here. So here I'm interested in an image. If we find an image, then I don't want to use the default image element, but instead this method will be called. In this method, we get data about the image which was found. And here we then should return our own JSX element. So we could return the built-in image, but then we just do what React Markdown does anyways. And we set the source and so on. That's not what I'll do here. Instead, I'll return the next JS image element, the next JS image component, which we therefore, of course, also need to import. We import image from next image, like this. So that's what we return here then. And then we set the source to something, the alt text to something, and also width and height, like this. Now let's start with alt. The image which we get here is actually an object with the image data React Markdown got from the Markdown text. And the alt text, for example, in Markdown is the text between those square brackets. So that is already made available by React Markdown, and hence we can set alt to image.alt. The name, the URL of the image, so the thing between the parentheses, this here, is also made available by React Markdown. It's also available on this image object, and it's the image URL. But that's just a file name in our case. We need a full path here, and for that I'll create a template literal where I point at images/posts/post slug, so the slug for this loaded post, slash, and then this URL, this file name, which was stored in the Markdown file. So in this case, image.url. So now that's that. Now for width and height, it always comes down to how you present this, to your styles and so on. Here, a width of 600 and a height of 300 pixels should work quite well. Now with that, since we pass custom renderers to renderers, this next image will be rendered instead of a default image. If we save that and reload, that fails. Actually, because it's not image URL, but image source here, src. My bad. So image src is the property on this image object, which holds a pointer at the image we're using. And if we change this to image src, we now see our image rendered here with the dimensions we gave it. But if we open the dev tools, we'll be greeted with a lot of warnings here. The warning in the end tells us that we're rendering a div inside of a paragraph, because the next image element is actually not just an image. Instead, it is wrapped in a couple of divs which control its positioning and styling and so on. And that's all rendered automatically by next. And that's then nested inside of a paragraph, because the Markdown is translated to HTML such that all content which is not a title or a list or something like this is treated as a paragraph, including images. We can ignore this. It works, but if we want to get rid of that error, of that warning, which it is, we can also do that by not overriding the image, but by instead getting a bit more tricky. Instead of only overriding images here in our custom renderer, we can actually have a look at all paragraphs which are being rendered. So this now includes everything which would be rendered as a paragraph, including plain text, like this one or this one, but also images, which, as we just saw, are also rendered as paragraphs. Then here we still get that paragraph identified by React Markdown, and we can return our own JSX element. And here, the trick is that I only want to override the default if we actually find that an image would be rendered inside of the paragraph. And I will leave all other kinds of paragraphs alone. For this, we can extract the actual node, which would be rendered by React Markdown from paragraph, and then check if the node if the first child of that node, if the type of that is image. So if we are trying to render an image element as a direct child of that paragraph. If we do render an image inside of the paragraph, I will overwrite what React Markdown wants to render. And instead of rendering a paragraph with an image inside of it, I then instead want to render just an image, just my next image. So for this, I'll then get my image by accessing node children and then the first child. And then I'll return a div actually with some extra styling where I add a class of image. That's simply a class I defined here in the CSS file. And in there, I'll then render this next image. So here I'll just repeat the code from up there, grab that code, add it here, like this, and we're good. Now we can get rid of this custom renderer, and I'll comment it out so that we still see it, but will not use it anymore because we will now change images by looking into paragraphs and looking for images there, and then replacing the entire paragraph with a div with the image. Now otherwise, if we don't make it into this if check, I will return a regular paragraph with paragraph children inside of it. So I'll basically render what React Markdown would have rendered otherwise. So I'll just use that unchanged content it identified, wrapped in a regular paragraph. If we do this and reload, the image is broken simply because here it's now actually not image source but image URL. That can be confusing, but it is different here when we're not handling just an image, but a paragraph that may contain an image. Then the image which we get from inside the paragraph has the file name stored in a URL property instead of source. But with that, it works. And that's now the image presented on the screen. Now rendered again with Next.js, as we can tell by the complex structure here and the fact that different images are fetched for different screen resolutions. And in the console, if we reload, we have no warnings. And that's how we can override how certain elements are rendered. And the image was just one example, because another popular use case could be code snippets. That's what we're going to explore in the next step.